The air smelled of wet metal and smoke. Boots slammed against frozen earth. A distant explosion shook the ground. Somewhere a radio hissed in static, panicked breaths echoed in the cold night. No one realized the shadowy figure would change everything. A group of women huddled behind crumbling walls, their eyes wide, hands trembling. Orders shouted in a language they barely understood. A scream pierced the chaos, then silence. And then something impossible happened. It was 1944, deep in the forests of Eastern Europe. A small contingent of German women soldiers had been captured during a chaotic retreat. They were no ordinary prisoners. They carried knowledge, secrets, and whispers of plans the Allies and Axis alike wanted buried. The stakes were enormous. If a single detail escaped, entire operations could collapse. Cities could fall. Troops could be ambushed. And yet the women were warned, never speak of what came next. Maps showed the surrounding forests, dotted with watchtowers and hidden encampments. Every footstep was a potential trap, every shadow a threat. But no one realized the real danger hadn't even appeared yet. A sudden crack of gunfire shattered the frozen silence, echoing through the dense trees like a warning from the shadows. Sparks from a distant flare briefly illuminated the terrified faces of the women huddled behind shattered walls and fallen logs. The forest floor trembled under the pounding of boots, and the metallic scent of blood and wet mud filled the air. Messages hurriedly carried by runners arrived with urgent whispers, but one slipped through the chaos, delivered with trembling hands, sealed in crude paper, cryptic and urgent. It bore a name, written in hurried, almost frantic scrawl, a woman among the captured, and a command that made even seasoned officers hesitate. "This wasn't supposed to happen. This changes everything," one whispered, barely audible over the cracking gunfire. The implications were immediate and terrifying. Someone had broken protocol, someone had sent a signal, and someone knew exactly who was there. Panic rippled through the ranks as the women exchanged fearful glances, each realizing the fragility of their position. Their captors, previously confident in their control, froze momentarily, the weight of uncertainty pressing down. Whispers spread among the prisoners. Who sent it? Why mention her? What secrets did her survival or disappearance hold? Each question hung in the freezing air like a ghost, unanswered and ominous. Every movement now carried the potential for disaster. Every shadow might conceal an enemy. And through the chaos, one truth became chillingly clear. The next 90 seconds would determine whether anyone survived. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the night pressing close as fate teetered on a knife's edge. And the next 90 seconds would determine whether anyone survived. The forest had become a labyrinth of terror. Each tree, blackened by shadow, seemed to loom closer, pressing down on the women as they pressed themselves against the wet, cold earth. Every sound, the snapping of a branch underfoot, the crack of distant artillery, the sudden hiss of static from a broken radio, triggered panic in waves. Boots splashed through icy mud, leaving jagged prints behind, evidence of movement that might betray their position. Somewhere above, flares painted ghostly streaks across the canopy, illuminating terrified faces only to leave them in darkness moments later. The prisoners were trapped in a world where every heartbeat seemed amplified, each breath a countdown to disaster. From the command room, the officers were frantically trying to piece together reports that made little sense. Coordinates contradicted one another, messages crossed in the night, and the static-laden radio threatened to cut off before a single actionable command could reach the front lines. "Reinforcements are delayed, no. They're on the wrong flank." Repeat, wrong flank. A voice barked over the chaos, sharp with frustration, but there was no one who could fix the confusion. They watched as screens flickered, maps zoomed in and out, symbols blurring into incomprehension. Intelligence that had once promised clarity now offered only riddles. On the ground, the women were acutely aware of their vulnerability. One crouched behind the remnants of a wall, fingers pressed to ears to block out the sporadic explosions, eyes darting toward shadows that might conceal a threat, or might be nothing at all. Her companion whispered reassurances that sounded hollow even to her own ears, as fear gnawed at the edges of every thought. Commands shouted in languages half-remembered from hurried lessons floated above the cacophony, but meaning was lost in the frantic beat of uncertainty. Someone screamed somewhere, a sound swallowed immediately by another round of gunfire, and the forest itself seemed to close in, a living prison that mocked their efforts to stay hidden. Every attempt to move brought a new obstacle. Fallen branches snagged coats and gear, muddy terrain slowed every step, and frozen roots threatened to trip those fleeing from imagined threats. One woman slipped, scraping her hands raw against bark, blood mixing with mud, but the pause was deadly. For a second, it seemed the earth itself was conspiring, turning even the simplest action into a potential death sentence. Yet movement was necessary. To remain still was to become a target for those whose eyes, hidden in darkness, tracked every twitch of muscle. Meanwhile, at another point in the forest, the sounds of an approaching squad echoed faintly, boots crunching through frost-hardened leaves. The prisoners froze, barely breathing, as the soldiers moved closer, unaware that some of their own had misread orders. Mistaking allies for enemies, friendly units exchanged gunfire in fragmented bursts. The cacophony of battle multiplied. Shouting, gunfire, flares, and the screams of the injured overlapping into a single, terrifying roar that made coherent thought nearly impossible. In one small clearing, a pair of women had been tasked with carrying vital documents. Every step was measured, careful, but the frozen ground offered little traction. A misstep sent the papers fluttering to the ground, caught in the wind like fragile wings, teasing them with their possible destruction. A nearby tree shivered, either from the wind or from a distant explosion. There was no way to tell, but the movement drew eyes, panicked and suspicious. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound a signal of impending disaster. Back at the command post, officers argued furiously over what little intelligence had made it through. "They should have been here 10 minutes ago," one shouted. "No, they've been rerouted, coordinates are off by a full kilometer." Another slammed a fist against the table, paper maps sliding to the floor, and the officers scrambled to correct the mistakes. Yet, for every solution proposed, 3 new problems emerged. Signals interfered. Radio equipment jammed. Flare readings were misinterpreted. The theater of war itself had become a puzzle with no edges, a nightmare of chance and timing where human error and fate intertwined in lethal precision. The women's reactions varied with each passing second. One whispered a prayer she didn't believe in, another clenched a hidden knife with shaking hands, ready to defend against threats she could barely see. Each person's fear was individual but compounded, creating a collective tension that was palpable, almost physical, in the frozen night air. The forest seemed to respond to their fear. Wind whispered through the trees like mocking laughter, shadows shifted with an almost sentient awareness, and the distant thud of artillery punctuated the sense that time itself was collapsing. Amid this, micro-threats arose that were no less deadly than the visible ones. A jammed weapon refused to fire at a critical moment. A misread signal caused a small detachment to advance into enemy fire. A hurried whisper passed between officers but arrived seconds too late to prevent disaster. Every complication layered onto the last, a cascade of chaos that left no room for rational thought. Yet, decisions had to be made. Choices, often impossible, had to be executed instantly. Hesitation was as lethal as action. And through it all, the forest seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every shadow could conceal a sniper, every sound might indicate an ambush, every sudden gust of wind might betray their location. The women learned to move silently, to hold their breath for minutes at a time, to trust instinct over instruction. Yet instinct was a fragile ally. Fear undermined even the best judgment. Allies appeared and vanished. Friendly signals were misinterpreted, and every sense was stretched to its limit. But this wasn't the real problem. The true danger lay unseen, an intelligence breach, a hidden observer whose knowledge could unravel everything. Somewhere in the distance, the subtle crunch of a single boot hinted at a presence neither recognized nor anticipated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the tension it generated was immense. The forest had become a theater not only of chaos but of suspense, a place where uncertainty was as lethal as gunfire. The night stretched, moments blending into one another as the women pressed forward, reacting to threats real and imagined. Every corner, every fallen log, every rustle of leaves could conceal catastrophe. Commands shouted from a distance collided with instinctive reactions on the ground. Strategic miscalculations multiplied. Allies were lost in the confusion. And yet, through fear and exhaustion, the prisoners continued, driven by the fragile hope that survival was possible, that they could somehow navigate the chaos that had become their entire world. Something bigger was coming. The forest had descended into a nightmare of fire, shadow, and frantic movement. What had started as controlled chaos was now total disarray. Flashes of gunfire lit faces twisted in fear, mud-spattered uniforms clung to trembling bodies, and the scent of smoke, blood, and wet earth mixed into a pungent fog that made breathing difficult. The women pressed forward through shattered trees and shattered nerves, each step a gamble between life and death. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, their movements uncertain, sometimes firing at the wrong targets, their orders tangled in miscommunication and panic. Every sound was a signal, every shadow a potential assassin, every misstep a deadly mistake. Somewhere ahead, one of the prisoners noticed a break in the enemy's line, a narrow, ice-covered ravine that offered a fleeting chance of escape. But reaching it would require crossing open ground under gunfire, risking both lives and documents that contained vital intelligence. Time stretched taut as every decision became monumental. "Go now," one whispered, eyes darting to cover each movement. Another hesitated, caught between instinct and caution, the weight of responsibility pressing down like the coldest iron. The air seemed to constrict around them, the forest closing in as if aware of the lives balanced on its frozen floor. Betrayal emerged amid the chaos. An officer, previously assumed to be loyal, had vanished from the group, and subtle signs indicated he might have aligned with a hidden adversary. Each woman's instinct screamed that not all threats came from the open, some came from those they had trusted. Whispers of uncertainty, previously minor, became deafening in their minds. Every glance over the shoulder carried a dual threat, the visible enemy advancing from the shadows and the invisible danger among their ranks. The tension was suffocating, yet movement was necessary. The women's courage began to take on an almost desperate intensity. One led the way across the ravine, slipping on ice, clinging to branches, the documents pressed close to her chest. Each step was measured yet frantic, driven by raw survival instincts and the unspoken understanding that hesitation would be fatal. Others followed, fear etched into every line of their faces, while bullets whipped past like angry hornets. Screams and shouts intermingled with the crackle of gunfire, a chaotic symphony of violence that seemed to stretch time itself. At the command center, the remaining officers tried to regain control, but the forest's chaos had overwhelmed every plan. Maps, once clear and precise, were now irrelevant. Signals blinked, miscommunications multiplied, and every move forward threatened catastrophe. The impossible decisions continued. Orders had to be made with incomplete information, rescues attempted with half the force, and cover relied on luck rather than strategy. Every misstep could trigger a cascade of destruction, but every choice carried the faint hope of salvation. Then came the moment that no one could anticipate. A sudden explosion tore through a nearby supply cache, sending flames and shrapnel into the air. The shockwave knocked several women off their feet, disorienting them, scattering documents and forcing a hasty scramble for cover. Eyes wide with disbelief, they watched comrades fall and rise again, blood mingling with mud, breath ragged, hearts racing as adrenaline surged. It was a trial by fire, one where courage was measured not in moments but in seconds, and where every heartbeat counted. Emotional stakes reached a peak. Promises whispered to family members, hidden messages to loved ones, and unfulfilled vows to comrades all surged in their minds. Some women had already endured unimaginable loss, and each choice now could add to it. Yet even in that chaos, acts of heroism emerged. One woman shielded another from a falling tree limb. Another dragged a wounded comrade across open ground, risking exposure to enemy fire with every step. Heroism was not grand. It was immediate, desperate, and terrifyingly human. Signals continued to flash, intermittent and confusing, adding to the tension. Maps and diagrams became frantic overlays on screens, blinking with warnings and alerts, offering only fragments of the reality on the ground. The battlefield became a chessboard where pieces moved unpredictably, and each action or inaction carried life-or-death consequences. Decisions made in fractions of a second could alter the outcome entirely. And yet, despite exhaustion, terror, and uncertainty, the women pressed on, driven by the instinct to survive and the fragile hope that escape was possible. And then, in a moment that no historian could explain, everything changed. A sudden silence fell over the battlefield, as if the forest itself had paused to witness the turning of fate. Enemy movements halted, reinforcements stopped advancing, and the women found themselves in a precarious stillness that allowed a fleeting clarity. In that instant, opportunities emerged, choices that could not have existed a moment before. The fragile, chaotic thread of survival stretched taut, ready to snap, yet holding just long enough for courage, instinct, and desperation to intersect. The climax was not a grand battle but a series of impossible decisions: when to move, when to stay, whom to trust, and which risks to take. Each second was a razor's edge, every breath a gamble, every glance a potential betrayal. And through it all, the women endured, fought, and made choices that would determine the story of their survival or their disappearance for decades to come. The forest grew silent after the chaos, as if holding its breath, allowing only the soft crunch of ice and debris under cautious feet. Those who had survived the night moved like shadows, exhausted, trembling, yet driven by an instinct stronger than fear. Every step carried the weight of what had been lost: comrades who had vanished, promises left unfulfilled, and secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The women had crossed impossible ground, witnessed horrors no one outside the forest could imagine, and made choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They were survivors, but survival came at a cost that could never be fully measured. Years passed, and the fragments of that night began to surface in scattered, tantalizing pieces. Diaries hidden beneath false linings of suitcases, letters smuggled through wartime channels, and whispering testimonies collected decades later offered glimpses of what had happened. Each document hinted at courage, betrayal, sacrifice, and terror, yet none told the full story. Some women returned home, their silence a shield against the curiosity and pressure of the outside world. Others disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the fog of war or perhaps by secrets too dangerous to expose. One diary, recovered long after the war, revealed intimate details of the women's fears and decisions, thoughts recorded in trembling handwriting, the ink smudged by tears and mud. The entries described frozen nights hiding in wreckage, moments when death seemed inevitable, and the unbreakable bond between comrades who relied on one another for survival. There were accounts of betrayal by those trusted, of heroic acts under impossible circumstances, and of decisions made in seconds that would shape entire lives. Yet the diary ended abruptly, the final pages torn or lost, leaving the ultimate fate of some women a mystery forever locked in time. Eyewitness accounts surfaced as well, often contradictory, their accuracy blurred by decades and trauma. One survivor remembered a shadowed figure guiding them through danger. Another recalled the sudden halt of enemy fire that allowed their escape, and yet another described documents slipping through hands before vanishing into oblivion. Official archives contained fragments too, reports filed late, classified files with gaps, and photographs of empty barracks or abandoned encampments. Even historians who pieced together the events could only sketch the outlines, never revealing the full, terrifying picture of what had truly occurred. And the secret that haunted the story above all else was the warning. The women were told never to speak. It was not merely a suggestion. It was a command enforced by fear, secrecy, and perhaps threats that reached beyond the war itself. Why the events of that night remained classified, why some survivors refused to speak, and what they saw in the darkness of the forest is still unknown. The fragments suggest something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. But the truth remains hidden, locked in archives, whispered in fragments, and feared enough to silence those who survived. And the truth about what she saw that night is still locked in archives, waiting for the day when perhaps it will be told. The story lingers, haunting, incomplete, and yet profoundly human. A tale of courage, terror, and the shadows that survive long after the war has ended. The forest may have returned to stillness, but the echoes of that night continue to ripple through history, a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to reveal, and some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved.